Barbara Peters from the Poison Pen, Scottsdale's Mystery Bookstore, with another event from our criminal calendar. We have with us today urbane, witty, handsome, distinguished British author Michael Dibdin. Don't giggle.
Oh, yeah?
You are all those things. He's one of my favorite writers and actually an author that I collect myself. These are my books here on the table because, regrettably, one or two of them aren't currently in print in the United States, but I like to show them off. Michael, thank you so much for coming.
It's a pleasure.
Into the sunshine from the rains of Seattle.
That's right.
You are British, were educated in England and Scotland, but now you make your home in Seattle. Is that going to affect your writing, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I never quite know what's going to affect my writing. I mean, I assume it is. I hope it is, because otherwise I think I would have gone into sort of a coma. I mean, you have to assume that everything is going to affect your writing. I mean, for example, moving to Italy, which I did purely for reasons of pleasure and also to earn some money. I worked in Italy as a teacher of English as a foreign language, so it was a job. And there was a kind of lottery about where one could have got a job, you know, including places like Libya and Turkey and so on, which they tried to fob me off with first. But I ended up in Italy, and as a result of that, I've now written, you know, these 5 books, whatever it is, then actually set in Italy, which is a place I know quite well. So one has to assume that, yeah, that you do make use of things that happen, but I don't think there's any kind of great sort of Soviet 5-year plan of, you know, I will move here and then write about that. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, stuff happens, and then you try and work with the material you've got.
You did, in fact, give the Northwest as the setting for your serial killer thriller, Dark Spectre.
Yeah, that was fortuitous. I mean, simply because I happened to be living in the Northwest. I wanted to write an American book, and I'm using American here almost, as it were, with a small a, because during the 70s I spent 5 years in Canada, which of course is just, you know, a few hundred miles north of Seattle, in the West. I've always lived in the West. I've never lived in the East, so this is very much a Western, North American take. And I had that little sort of parcel of experiences, which from about 1970 to 75, which I wanted to do something with. That was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it also is if you're a writer in, you know, the genre that we both work in, you know, there is an American model for this. I mean, there's also a British model. You know, there is the cozy. You know, there's the Agatha Christie, you know, little village where everyone's perfectly happy, except that corpses keep turning up in inconvenient places. There is also an American model, you know, which is the sort of mass, random, violent death, Silence of the Lambs scenario, which is, as it were, in cinematic terms, you know, that's a larger cast of thousands, widescreen, surround sound production, you know, and I've been doing a lot of the other thing in one way or another, and I just thought it would be fun to have a go at the American version, and also at the same time to use my, as I say, American with a small a, in other words, North American, geographically North American experiences, and I set it in Seattle because that's where I happened to be living, and so it was the place I knew best. It was also a place that hadn't been written about too much. You know, in the way that, I mean, one feels that Elroy has done Los Angeles, you know, or Chandler indeed has done Los Angeles, you know, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, these all have people who have prior claims on the territory and certainly know a lot more about it than I do. Seattle, although there are a lot of local crime writers, has never quite sort of hit the, has never sort of become sort of a world-class mystery written about place. But at the same time, I was very gratified to find when I went to live there that everyone knows where it is. You know, so if you know, when I'm on a European tour and I go to Vienna or Paris or Rome or London or wherever it is, and they say, oh, you know, where are you living? And I say Seattle, and they say, oh yes, Seattle. You know, so I mean, this is not like sort of Oshkosh or wherever, you know.
True. Maybe it's a climate thing. Maybe Brits tend to like Seattle because you've got some climatic carryover there.
That's possible.
She says snidely, living in Arizona. What a rat. Actually, it worked very well for your story there because, as I recall, you had a fundamentalist, your serial killer had a religious motivation, and I thought that sort of shrouded, foggy, you know, kind of darker Northwest worked a lot better than if he'd been out here in the clear light of day in the desert broiling in the sun. I mean, some settings suit, I think, stories better than others, and it seemed to me that one worked really well where you...
Well,
agree?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if I wanted to be immodest, I would say that I think it worked really well because I made it work really well.
You can do that. For sure,
because actually, I mean, as we know, you know, and you know, I mean, Waco being an obvious example. I mean, and indeed, to some extent, a model for you know some of the things that happened in that book. You know, that sort of stuff does happen also under these kind of skies. So I don't think the kind of skies that you're under need, you know, necessarily have any take on it. But I was interested to find when I moved to Seattle that there had been a long tradition in the San Juan Islands, which is this little archipelago of islands just north of Seattle, up towards the Canadian frontier, of people who are now regarded as relatively legitimate, like the Theosophists and so on, you know, but at the time were regarded, I mean, they were cults,
right.
You know, but there's a certain point at which a cult becomes an accepted religion. I mean, the Mormons are a classic example. I mean, they started off as a cult, and then they became a religion. Exactly how one works that one, I don't quite know, but you know, the Theosophists and some, you know, people who didn't quite make it to religion status were you know, holed up there on these islands. And I got the thing that this was partly because of, you know, the old idea that the whole continent is tilted slightly towards the west, so all the loose cannons, you know, roll down the deck until they hit the coast. And then they realized there's nowhere to go except Japan, and it's a long way to Japan. So, you know, they tend to end up, you know, hanging around. And there's also something about island people, I should say, which I've always been aware of, because I mean, I grew up in Ireland, which of course is itself a relatively small island, but also has a lot of smaller islands off it, you know. And there are people who choose to live on islands, and I mean, nothing personal here, but it takes a certain mentality to live on an island. I mean, I couldn't do it. I love islands, but I mean, I would go crazy in 2 days. You know, just that idea of being circumscribed and not being able to get off without, you know, waiting for the ferry or...
True enough.
You know, if your boat is available and so on.
You know,
but there are people who get off on that, and there are a lot of them in the Pacific Northwest.
I'm sure that's true. I'm also sure we've managed to demonstrate for our listeners that it's very easy for a reader to impute to an author things that the author never intended. And the author probably is sometimes surprised to discover what, in fact, the reader has written into, you know, read into.
Well, that's the whole, frankly, that's the whole joy of being published, or, I mean, apart from getting paid, obviously, which is also right. Good news. But, I mean, to me, the biggest joy of getting published is meeting people at, you know, bookstore events and signings and, you know, other places where you meet people who've read your books, and them coming up and sort of saying, gosh, I just love this because, you know, and you think, huh? That wasn't what I meant at all. But then you realize that actually, you know, it's completely possible for it to be seen in that way, and it works, you know, completely well in that way. I mean, I really do think that the books are sort of like children, you know, I mean...
Right. You give them birth and then they grow.
You have them. You have 5 years to do the basics. And then after that, I mean, they're on their own. They're launched, you know, and things happen to them which you would never be able to predict, which you can't control, you know. I mean, all you can do is wish them well and hope for the best. And but at the same time, it's fascinating to see, you know, what does happen.
Absolutely true. And one of the things that I have loved about you from the beginning and your books is that you have experimented with a number of different forms, I presume partly to keep yourself from getting bored and partly for the challenge. But the first book that I read that you had written was A Rich Full Death, which is really a suspense novel. Victorian Robert Browning comes into it, and presumably the fact that you were then in Perugia teaching inspired you to use that Italian background.
Yes, it was partly that. It was partly also cold calculation, because in fact there was a book before that which I wrote, which is now back in print in Viking paperback, which was called The Sherlock Holmes Story,
right.
And that was a pastiche, obviously, of the Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes books.